So I've been muted for the past 2 minutes. Huh. That's fascinating. So, you know what? Things like this happen when you try things for the first time. So we're going to just get a little bit back into this. So welcome to my channel. That's embarrassing. It's okay. We do this sometimes. We make mistakes. I'm going to actually drop a comment in the chat. Start at the 2-minute mark. Oh, the joys and joys of the internet. That's okay. All right. Well, I just kind of prepped a response, so we're going to try that again. So welcome. My name is Justice Graves. Welcome to my channel. We're wasting time on this, but we're doing it one more time. Hit like, share, subscribe if you like this content. I talk about local governance all the time on the internet. I've been doing weekly streams lately, and I've been doing other materials. This is the first time that I have tried to do an intro sequence, and this is the first time I've muted myself on air for 2 minutes. So that is extremely exciting. That is one for the bloopers category. We're talking about bloopers with a few other people who do stuff online earlier, and oh boy, I think that's a bloopers category. That's quality blooper content. So without further ado, we're going to get into it. So today we're talking about North Carolina. I've done a few videos on this stuff. North Carolina is more of an interesting topic because we know that the populace over there and nationally in the United States is sort of aware that there's a lot going on in North Carolina with regards to social emotional learning. But just how far into social emotional learning is sort of another piece that we really need to have a conversation on. So how does social emotional learning, play into all of this, and where can we see it, and how is this sort of manifesting with regards to all of this sweet, sweet federal money that's been flowing through? And before we really get started, I want to caveat sort of the discussion here today with the whole, and I've read people the Riot Act on this, but I think this is probably important because there's a lot of people in North Carolina that I talk to. One of them is Deb from the Reason We Learn channel, fantastic channel. If you should go and watch that channel. Has been highlighting a lot of what's been going on with the SEL and the gender stuff happening in North Carolina. And what I really want to highlight to you is when we go through some of the stuff today in the state's plan's use of the federal funding from the American Rescue Plan Act for education. And we'll talk, and it sort of talks a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about how the ESSER, the regular ESSER money from the CARES and the CRSSA have sort of baked into it. That you can't, I think that North Carolina is a great example of how you cannot fix this, of how pervasive the bureaucracy of the whole institution really is. I reached out to Deb right before this stream and I said, have you ever heard of the Office of Learning, Recovery, and Acceleration? She's like, I've never heard of that. I said, well, you're going to find out at 9 tonight. There's a few other things that I think are going to be not surprising, but I think will sort of be informative as to what's going on when it comes to really everything to do with, I think it's a good mesh piece to understand how things have sort of been progressing in North Carolina and how we got to this point. And maybe this helps fill in some of the gaps. I don't know as well as Sloan and Deb what's been going on down there. I know there's been a lot of conversation. I know Superintendent Truitt, there's a big contract going on that's having a dispute over it, and the Board of Education down there with the state superintendent of instruction. There's a lot happening with regards to SEL, and it's a hotbed for this type of conversation. So I just want to sort of preface that I don't think that this is fixable. I don't think you can vote for any state superintendent and this is going to fix it. And I don't think that this is fixable even at the board level. Because as we're going to talk about in this particular plan, there's stages to this. Because North Carolina does things a little bit differently, the way that they sort of need to present to the state legislature or the state assembly to get things done. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds of it, but we've talked about this topic so many times. I think it's important in this particular one to get into some of the finer details, at least with you live, so that you can really start to visualize and see that chain of command and understand that unless you can get over about 400 people who at any time are either elected or appointed and could be removed, to understand the fine points on this, I don't think you fix this. I truly don't believe, and I think North Carolina, when we get into it, is a great example. You don't fix this. It's too pervasive, it's too aggressive, it's too widespread, and really the state itself is just broken like a record wheel on this SEL, SEL, SEL over and over and over again. But that's what happens when you ignore, or that's what happens when we don't realize that this is a public threat that's been going on. Without too much further ado, I'm kind of going to go back. We're going to talk about the state highlights. So let me share my screen. As always, I'm going to share my screen on some of this stuff. Federal North Carolina state highlights, and we're going to allow it. Okay, hopefully I can also edit this video later so that it cuts out the 2 minutes where I muted myself like a fool, but this stuff sort of happens. Also, I don't know why I'm in the shot like that. That does not make any sense. But it happens. So hopefully this is, well enough on your screen. So we start off all of these videos with going through the state plan highlights. This is basically what the state is bragging about is in its ARP ESSER plan. And there's a lot more highlights in this than what I had done on my Twitter thread about this. My Twitter is @JusticeJHG. If you want to follow me on there, it's @JusticeJHG. If you want to follow me on Twitter. You'll notice that one of the highlights I have is social emotional health. It's also social emotional learning. But now that we've learned on this channel a little bit more about what to look for in terms of the subtleties of these plans, let's go down to some of these. So North Carolina Department of Public Instruction has proposed allocating ESSER funds to support extended learning recovery after school enrichment. Basically after school programs, okay. And I'll highlight why that's so important later on. Staffing support. They're going to work directly with healthcare professionals to improve health and educational outcomes, expand on existing models that provide elementary schools with access to pediatricians via telehealth technologies. The reason I bring this up is because North Carolina, and there's a few parents that I'm not going to name publicly who have talked about this on the back end who I know about, where their children have, without parental consent, and North Carolina is pervasive about this. They don't really recognize parental consent on the issue of health. They will allow students to telehealth with psychologists and basically go on the telephone with psychologists or do like a Zoom call with psychologists or even go in person to psychologists to access medical care. Like we're talking direct medical care or other services. This is not really surprising. I know Sloan has been talking about this a lot on her channel with regards to some of the, the stuff happening in early childhood education, but this is across the board sort of the standard in North Carolina, that they are using the ESSER funds to sort of expand on this and as an excuse to work more closely with this. When we get into the plan itself, and this is sort of a prelude, and I'm only going to highlight this twice, once now and once later, when we get into the ESSER plan itself, one of the things I want to point out is that they talk a lot about how they do this telehealth stuff to help parents not be burdened with the cost. One of the parents whose child got telehealth services for therapy has been getting billed pretty substantially for services that the family didn't consent to and didn't agree to pay because the psychologist and the therapist was out of network, or I believe it was just a therapist. I don't know what type of therapist, but they may have also been practicing psychology. I would believe so, but that's not always true in some cases. Sometimes it's just a higher order counselor. But they've been charged as out of network. So they're paying a high burden for this. So just be aware that those kinds of events are happening behind the scenes, and also to decrease the impact of healthcare-related cross-site. And again, it actually mentions it explicitly here. That's not really what's happening. If you happen to be out of network with whatever random therapist that they put your child on, you're paying the foot bill on it, even if you didn't consent or know about it. Stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder groups are just groups that the district handpicks or that the state board handpicks that they want to discuss, and they will mix and match and double up on sections certain individuals. A school committee chair may also count as a parent if they have a child, so they fit 2 categories. It's not, if that's all you need for your stakeholder group, basically you just only need her or him, the chair of the school committee, and you're down with your stakeholder group. They're very biased. They're very bad. We've gone over this. The ARP ESSER advisory group will convene regularly. This ARP ESSER advisory group, and I need to look more into it with North Carolina, is composed of these stakeholders. So just be aware of that, that this is and they talk about using this group for feedback looping. So basically biased feedback looping, basically patting themselves on the back every 5 minutes, or, chastising themselves every 5 minutes, for things like inherent racism, etc. We know this. This channel understands that this type of woke activity is pretty common with the self-flagellation and the self-chastising and the self-patting on the back, which this State Board of Education really, really adopts and embraces. Members, of course, are appointed and represent each of the stakeholder groups. We've talked about that. So we're going to get off of that, and we're going to go straight into... And I hope people are watching this, even though I messed up and muted myself for 2 minutes there, because this is kind of important. We are going to stop screen sharing. We're going to share my screen again. And we're going to go straight into what's going on with the actual plan itself. This is North Carolina State Plan for the American Rescue Plan Act. And right away, the first thing I always look at, just so that I can get a background feel for how the state sort of works, is who is the chief school officer, authorized representative who can sign for this plan. And what's interesting, and this is different from all of the ones that we've seen so far, is that the signature of the authorized SCA representative. It's a Latricia Townsend. Now remember that, I can't remember her first name, but Catherine Truitt is the state superintendent of public instruction. She's not signing for this, which is very strange. Most of the states, their state superintendents or their state commissioners of education or state secretaries of education, I believe there's also state secretaries of education as well in some of these states, are the ones signing for the state on this. There's a whole different thing here going on. And this person seems to have, we can't see their signature. Their signature is redacted under some statute, some type of section B6, which tells me that they're not an elected representative, which tells me that there's some type of bureaucrat. So, I'm going to kind of flash the screen off for a minute, and we're going to go into, okay, well, who is this Latricia Townsend? Because that might be a little bit important. And, this type of stuff is not boring. Screen share. Come on. Where are we? Allow it. Haha. So when you look her up and you type in department, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, you get to the federal program contacts by staff member. And you go down. Excuse me. This is what live stuff does to people. And you go down and you try and look for Latricia Townsend. Dr. Latricia Townsend. She is the division director of federal program contracts. So they have a department that has to do with federal programs like ESSER, and I'm actually going to switch to the next section on it that, does stuff with ESSER, that does stuff with CARES, and look at that to ensure that federal and state education funds contribute to the goal of all students meeting or exceeding rigorous state guidelines, blah, blah, blah. We go down on the list. In the federal funds. So they have a whole department that works on just exclusively this. The state superintendent, I don't know how they interact with this, but if you go down to the bottom, there's equity webinars, pretty much on the page that sort of supports this. equity webinar, equity webinar, equity webinar, equity webinar. I'm going to put this these links in the description for the video when we're done. They deal stuff with ESSER, selected links. So it's, if this is the federal level of it. It's pretty much, as much as you would expect. Stakeholder analysis template. Didn't look at all of that. What I got interested in was some of the other programs underneath it. And one of the ones that I noticed, I don't know if it's on the side here, but it's called, I don't think it's Equitable Services for Private Schools, blah, 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 blah. It might not be on this section. If I'm thinking, oopsie, that is not what we wanted. That is fine. We're going to find that in a minute. The joys of being live when you mess up this kind of stuff. Office of Learning. Office of Learning Recovery and Acceleration. This is other stuff that website that I was showing you has other stuff that I'm sure that the people in North Carolina didn't know was available to them. But let's go back to, I don't know if we need to go back to the ARP ESSER plan. We might need to just sort of kind of go through my logic on this. So we'll go back to the ARP ESSER plan. Screen share, North Carolina State Plan, allow. So this is unusual. This was a little bit unusual and jarring. And one of the things, and this is different for this one compared to every other state education plan, is that North Carolina doesn't use color coding to really differentiate between what the state is asking and how they're answering it. We've seen, this blue color used when it's either the state talking or the federal government asking a question. The federal government asks a question in blue that the state needs to answer. The state answers in black. The state asks a question in black. The federal government asks a question in black. The state government asks or responds to that in blue. We've seen that. This one, it merges the two, so you have to be very careful when you read through this, and you have to try and get a little bit on the lingo here. North Carolina just loves to inundate you with alphabet soup, so basically just acronym after acronym after acronym. Some of the acronyms you'll see in this: SBE is for the State Board of Education. PSU is a public school unit, I believe. And then you have the DPI, which is the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, the NCDPI, and then there's the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the NCDHHS, but they also refer to it exclusively as the DHHS without the NC in the beginning. So you got to really pay attention. There is also the normal Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, which is called the DHHS. So you have to know which one they're talking about, if the NC is in front of it or if it's not. Most of the time when they're talking about the federal one, it's the normal DHHS without it, but it's all over the place. Requirements, blah, 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 per Carolina law. And then you get down to here, and there's this Office of Learning Recovery and Acceleration, or the OLR, will conduct a systemic assessment of the various initiatives undertaken throughout the state and funded through ESSER. And you're like, what in the world are we talking about here? And as the Office of OLR and identifies programs and practices for inclusion on the dashboard, we will encourage and support LEAs as they submit their programs to the Department Safe for Schools and Best Campuses Clearinghouse. LEA stands for Local Educational Authority or Association, or what have you. Replace it with whatever appropriate acronym you want to put there. I can't remember if it's association or authority or agency, but I think any one of those is appropriate in this case. So you're like, okay, what is that office? And we're going to talk about that because that was sort of a surprise. I was like, Deb, what is this? And she's like, I've never heard of it. Deb from the Reason We Learn channel, which is a fantastic channel. I don't know if I'm repeating myself or not, but you should follow her at the reasonwelearn.locals.com. Fantastic stuff. The mission of OLR is to preserve public school units by providing research and support needed to make evidence-based decisions to combat learning loss and accelerate learning for all students. It looks like this department this office got created as a result of COVID-19. And you can see who's in charge of it, and you're like, okay. And then you go to the school extension learning and enrichment program. You just kind of click on one of these and you're like, okay, what are we talking about here? And they have a cross-disciplinary team of subject area experts and staff with resources. And you're like, okay. And, you kind of go through. I don't know why. It's being weird now. Let me pull it up because it's being like it's overlaying on itself. It's like, there we go. Like, for example, like, you're going through and you're like, what in the world are we looking at? So extension, Brazil art project details, SEL sports, presentation, summer school. One of the things that's in ARPA and CARES funding is that people need to do summer enrichment programs. So I'm like, okay, well, this is pretty on the nose. Like, what is this going to lead me towards next? And you go look it up and you're like, okay, social and emotional supports for summer school. Pretty explicit. And we already know that the definition that North Carolina does for social emotional learning, they're very pervasive with Panorama. It's sort of something that I'm going to mention. Panorama isn't mentioned. At least I didn't catch it. I might have to do a search within the document. I forgot to do that before I did this stream. Social emotional, Panorama Incorporated and Castle are not mentioned in North Carolina's ARP ESSER plan. I don't know if it's mentioned in the CARES Act stuff that they did or the CRSSA stuff, but it's not mentioned in this explicitly in what we're reviewing tonight. I find that very interesting because we know that they're doing a lot of contracts behind the scenes, but this particular document is very concerning, and I will link it in the description at the end of this. Social emotional learning for the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. There's a lot to go through here. I'm not going to. What I basically want you to sort of recognize is that they are very much promoting public resources on this. State resources for how to integrate. They have state standards for mapping, SEL standards, and then they have this thing called Everfee. Apparently, Everfee, who is Everfee? It's a network of schools. They deliver digital resources free of charge so that teachers can equip students with stuff. And by that, I mean, this isn't a PowerPoint presentation about social emotional learning. So let's take it at its face. They're providing free of charge curriculum at no cost, unlimited student licenses. And they have over 961 schools participating. And their standards are such as Castle. Oh, look at that. Jumpstart National Standards and Next Generation Science Standards. I don't know if these two are okay. I just know that, Castle we're talking about is one of the big problems. Why do I mention this? Because I think that's something that the people down in North Carolina didn't realize was that, and I don't know how to say this, they're like, well, why is everything, why is it like all these school districts are doing the exact same thing over and over and over again? And this is one of the answers for why. The state is promoting available resources across the board. And while that's not a statewide curriculum and why that doesn't control at the county level completely, that has that effect. If you give people free stuff, they're going to use it. And it's not really free. It's being paid for through different grants and state ways that they sort of manipulate and do this sort of stuff. I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of it. It's a little bit difficult, and that would require a deep dive on my end. But North Carolina is clearly participating strongly in this type of material. What I really want to point out is that since it's free, it acts as basically a universal curricula. All the resources are basically universal curriculum for each of their programs, which is why you see CASEL so widespread and why those contracts with Panorama are so pervasive in North Carolina, and why North Carolina is basically, ground zero for some of the stuff we're seeing with social emotional learning, because they've made it available to everybody, which means that students, teachers will adapt it in their own ways for their classrooms and for their subjects, but they're going to do it. This is a 30-page presentation. I am sure that there is a lot, and course topics that they sort of talk about with the quote-unquote compassion project, empathy, growth mindset, interactive scenarios, so role-playing, and it goes on and on. Some of these aren't, I would really need somebody to look through this with me who is more education oriented, but this program, Everfee, really asserts that social emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. SCL is a process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities. That is a total lie. Manage emotions. We don't need social emotional learning to manage our emotions and achieve personal and collective goals. We don't need it for this. Feel empathy for others. We don't need it. There's a lot of assertions in here that a lot of psychologists and a lot of people in education have been, banging the drum of that this is completely incorrect, and I would defer to those people on this because that's a bigger conversation that I can have. But it's steps for identifying, selecting evidence-based. Oh, good. Analyze classrooms, disaggregate data, review efforts, identify the scope, determine the teacher readiness, selecting the appropriate programming, continually monitor and evaluate, so it's in a feedback loop. So it doesn't really end. CASEL's guide, I'll look at that. They're really pumping it up. So this makes a lot of sense when you look at it sort of in the deeper end, how when they have a program or a venture like this, I don't want to call it really a program. I want to call it more of a business venture that the state has really invested into as an educational item that is really, really bad. Oh, this is so bad. All right. We'll get to that in a bit. That's not good. We'll stop with that, and we will remove that from the stream, and we'll go to the next item. Like I said, I'm going to try and take out those 2 minutes where I've accidentally muted myself like a child. And we'll see what happens. Share my screen. Allow it. Let's see what this looks like. All right. So now we know what the Office of Learning Recovery does, and now we have a little bit more insight into how widespread CASEL has been spread, which is everywhere. Working with inside the department, that's not biased at all, and external stakeholders. So basically a biased feedback loop, blah, 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 social emotional. This is how the state is responding. They think that that's really important. This is a really interesting section. They're talking about what they're answering here from the federal government is how what are the needs of students? So for students from low-income families, they identify that recovery from instructional time and social emotional needs are important. Then for some reason, students who are of racial and ethnic background or who are more important in those subcategories need to recover from lost instructional time, and for some reason need to accelerate in math and reading. The whole state could really use that, but whole other discussion. Then they go into gender, and they say that for some reason, social emotional learning is high on that. And then lost instructional time is sort of, it's kind of in there. They go to English language learners. It's about, actually learning English might actually be important. Recovery from lost instructional time, which they put in almost every single one of these, which is kind of pointless. And then they, no offense, they just kind of copy and paste for the rest of these. They kind of flip things out. Social emotional. They just kind of flip. Their current estimates that strongly suggest that roughly 25% of the student population falls into an at-risk category, which North Carolina has general statutes that sort of describe that. I don't want to get into theirs. Just there's some technicalities as to what at-risk actually means in North Carolina, but we can discuss that later. Then there is a table that sort of talks about, and I don't know why it's always the third graders that get picked out, the third and the fourth graders that always get picked out for these type of assessments. I've sort of been noticing that in the data pools that they've been showing us in all of these state ARP ESSER plans, is that we're talking about what are the high priority needs, apparently for all of these subgroups, these important student groups that we just sort of described what their top priorities are, and now we're going to go into all of the priorities that they need. And this is really sort of obnoxious. They go through all of these subgroups and they copy and paste. And this is also the first state ARPA plan, for education, where I've seen the actual acronym SEL used all over the place. Normally, they say social emotional. They'll talk about it with regards to surveys. We've seen it talked about with regards in Arizona. They sort of flipped it and talked about it with respect to equity. And so you see equity everywhere. And then you also see it in terms of that weird discussion on we want a contract with Panorama, but we're using Castle first, and then it's going to bring us into our contract potential ideas with Panorama and these other organizations. But when we're looking at North Carolina, it's SEL, all throughout this thing, and they list it as the top priority and everything. And also flat out, and I accidentally didn't highlight it here, but first thing priority is SEL. It always is on all of these categories. And the second is youth risk behavior surveys. Apparently they need to conduct those. So their first priority is social emotional learning. Their last priority, and I don't know, this is not done in alphabetical order, so I have a feeling that this was done in their, listing priorities in order here, that they want to do these surveys, and it's every single one of these categories: 2 or more races, Hispanic, students by gender, English language learners. Now that, and look, taking out the fact that they need to do this access assessment, it is about English language learning stuff, so that is the second thing on this list. But a lot of this is not, look, it's just copy and paste a lot of this. SEL, youth risk behavior surveys are important. Every other group, incarcerated students. So, and I highlighted this here just to point out what the acronym of PSU means, which is public state, not public state, public school units. This is ridiculous. Clearly, we know what their priorities are: to survey the students to oblivion and to perpetuate the cycle with SEL. So let's go through here. I can't remember. I need to double check the statute on this. Every single state plan I've been seeing has been talking about that every 6 months that they have to evaluate what they're doing in terms of their progress, but I'm not completely sure if that is what we need, or I'm not completely sure how that fits with the statute itself. I haven't introduced you yet to the statute of what the ARPA plan says for the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which, by the way, does have the word social emotional in it. So just, if you think, oh, social emotional is, illegal in the act, no, it's actually mentioned in it. I've said it a few times, but just be aware of that. Evaluations every 6 months, so it, So this is sort of a weird discussion on what happened with regards to their plan for ARP ESSER. So, for example, The Department of Public Instruction in North Carolina presented it to the State Board of Education, their draft plan, and then they put it out for public comment. It went very bad. Over the course of the 30-day period, they received 230 comments categorized as follows with certain percentages. There's a lot of interest. Well, how about this? Social emotional learning was third on the list of highest, and then everybody was talking about CRT, which, of course, because the State Department of Instruction is woke, and we know that. They put a little asterisk next to the 88% of comments that were about CRT and said, it is important to note that CRT is not mentioned in the ARP ESSER state plan template. It's also important to note that CRT has many forms. Some of those are such as culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive learning, and you people are a bunch of liars who say that you're not doing this, even if it doesn't matter if it's in the template. We know it's happening. We know what's happening. You know what's happening. We know that you know that we know that it's happening, and you're just trying to gaslight us and, and get us on technicalities on that. They talk about how they're doing stakeholder engagement sessions, basically just feedback looping. It's so obnoxious. They don't really list the stakeholder groups unless I'm missing it in the appendices, which I didn't see that. They're a little bit more hesitant to reveal that to you. I am going to tell you who one of the stakeholder groups is, and I can list the other one if I look down here. One of them is the NCAA, not the NCAA, the NAACP. I was watching something today about the NCAA. Sorry about that. It's the NAACP. And they also have a student advisory member that gets selected to participate. Apparently, the student representative highlighted that, people need SEL support. I'm sorry, students have absolutely no idea what SEL is. They just hear that it's nice, and they hear that they, have nice they have conversations that maybe they manipulate them to make them feel good. And so, of course, if you're manipulated emotionally to feel good about a conversation, you're going to want to engage in that conversation more and more and more. And children have very addictive behaviors and fall into very bad patterns when it's a very, very aggressive positive feedback loop, like what SEL purports. In certain situations, SEL doesn't always do that, but you can see very pervasive psychological feedback, positive psychological feedback loops throughout it. You can also see that the student rep highlighted the importance of face-to-face instruction, and that online apparently an adequate number for both. So I guess this was probably more scripted of a response from the student that one would care to talk about. The NAACP, the North Carolina Teacher Advocacy Group, Association of Educators, the NCAE, and the NAACP. The ARP ESSER Advisory Group will convene in regular intervals. So basically feedback looping, recovery state plan, blah, blah, blah. They go back to that Office of Learning Recovery. So this is the thing about ARPA that we really kind of need to talk about, is how does it get to where it is? And it's through so let's talk about the separation of powers. When we're talking about a Department of Public Instruction like in North Carolina, or a Department of Education in a state, that is categorically an executive branch of government. When we're talking about the legislature, we're talking town meeting, we're talking city council, we're talking town representative meetings. Those are the legislature. Those are the bodies that have the power to put law into effect, whether it be bylaw or whether it be some type of zoning. They also have the power of the purse. The executive branch doesn't have that. Now, the interesting thing is that is a little grayer in this situation. In all of the states, what happens first is that a grant notification, and I'm overgeneralizing, I may be messing up some states, a grant notification goes over to the general assemblies, or to the Congress, or to the state, or to the general courts of each of them, basically the state legislatures. And from that point, the state legislature has to accept the money. They have to say, we accept it. And then things kick off from there. Some states are a little bit more involved in that. Some states, like in Massachusetts, they accepted the money and then they kicked over the regulatory aspect over to the state's higher level executive board of education, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for my state, particularly. North Carolina sort of did this in the reverse. What basically happened is that the Department of Public Instruction presented a plan to them to convince them to vote for the money. They said, we accept the money, go forth with your plan, and amend it as you need to. And then the Department of Public Instruction basically got this pot of money and said, cool, yo, peace out. We're going to do what we want. We don't care that you're a red assembly by. And that's kind of what's been happening. What has then been happening, and I've been experiencing this locally, whether it be with the ARPA funds for education or the ARPA funds that the cities and towns have been getting, is that now the executive branches exclusively have control. Now, those executive branches have a lot of elected members, but there's also a lot of appointed members in those executives. And as we all know, those executives are not well versed in what's going on. So, for example, my town select board has jurisdiction over the approximately $2.4 million that the town of Templeton got for ARPA money. These county boards of education in North Carolina were all granted a certain amount of funding individually. Those boards of education in North Carolina, those county boards of education, have exclusive control over that. They don't have to go to town meeting. They don't have to go to a city council and say, hey, give us the funds, power of the purse. No, because it was already granted at a higher level. And one of the important things to point out here is that these are considered grants. Grants don't go to your local legislature. They basically get passed through, and then federal regulation really dictates how that plays down if it's a federal regulatory grant. If it's a state grant, then it's state rules, and it was done a little bit differently, but you're basically talking about the same process. I am overgeneralizing here just to sort of get through this conversation that you can understand what's going on. There's a lot more process to this. But that's sort of what we're talking about here. How it sort of flows by. And here's the thing, and New Hampshire did this too. New Hampshire said, we didn't accept money for testing for COVID. Well, you did accept money for testing for COVID because that was the federal regulation for what was allowed to be used for under ARPA. So the local school districts spent money on it. Just because the General Assembly, and in New Hampshire, it's not the General Assembly, it's the, I can't remember if they're called the General Court or if they're just called the state legislature, but the New Hampshire state legislature, just to make it basic, they accepted funds that are allowed to be used like that. And all the local school districts used it like that. You know, just because you are not the arm, just because you're not the person putting those pieces together and smashing them together and making the gears turn, it doesn't mean that when you're just the arm that reaches out and gives the money, that you are not partially responsible for what's going on with that money. As we all know through the Commerce Clause of, the U.S. Congress, is that, the one who gives out the money has control over, and there's people who debate this, but this is generally what's accepted in the United States, is that under the Commerce Clause, when the federal government wants to pay for something, they dictate, and they go back and forth with what they're going to pay with. They dictate the terms and conditions and the regulations that money, that surround that pot of money that goes to that program. And New Hampshire and North Carolina and Arizona were no different about this. They handed out the money, but they control some of the rules and stuff that they can put around that money. There's federal regulation on this money, but they can make stricter laws. They can say, hey, state says federal government says you can do it for this. We're going to squeeze that down because it says that you can use it for this and this and this and this and this. So it doesn't say that you have to do all of them at once. So as long as you're fulfilling one of those categories, we're going to scratch off some of those. Theoretically, they could kind of do something like that. It's a little bit dicier on this particular qualification, but they could have put more restrictions in place. They could have had stronger reporting so that we know more about how that's operating, but they didn't. because that's what we're dealing with here. Another thing to point out in this document, and I'm kind of just looking at the clock, they then switch into calling ARP ESSER, ESSER 3, same thing, do not get confused. ARP ESSER and ESSER 3 are the same thing. Going down the list here, this is how they plan to use some of the money. Social emotional learning, that's a cool $10 million for social emotional learning from the state. Toolkits may include social and emotional health and well-being for teachers, SEL for students, and SEL for caregivers, aka parents. Basically, they're spending $10 million, and all of these categories, you may think are listed pretty intuitively and separate everything, but here's the thing, is that just because they're all listed differently doesn't mean that you can't mix and match SEL in there in different ways. So this 10 million doesn't really represent what's going on. It's just the 10 million that's earmarked exclusively for SEL programs. And remember, they're using it to create toolkits for teachers, students, and caregivers. So that's why it's so pervasive across the state. If you look at that, blah, 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 a lot of money, a lot of problems, a lot of ways that they're trying to use the money. They did use CARES 2 or ESSER 2 funds for school health. They used it to get school social workers. A cool 10 million came out of that. This is separate from the ESSER 2 conversation, the ESSER 3 conversation, or the ARP ESSER money. Blah, blah, blah. This is really bad. Are there additional funds? Funds from ESSER 1 and 2 were earmarked to support all students' SEL needs. Allowable personnel that they can purchase. And this is the thing, is that there's sort of a discussion going on with some people that I know about behind the scenes about what you can use ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 for. And there was a debate, well, you can't. CARES, CRSSA, and ARPA treat the educational section as completely severable, or not severable. Oh, I'm making up a new word. They treat them as separate from a lot of the rest of the document itself, except for a lot of the reporting requirements. And the reason for this is because in ESSER 1, it's a lot grayer, but in ESSER 2, the federal government explicitly allows you to use these funds to create new positions, which is not good economic policy. Well, it's not good fiscal policy. It has economic effects, so it's bad economic policy, because people will lose their jobs when these grants end. So, and they are grants. These are not permanent. They're not signing another several $trillion bill to inject into the state governments. Like, this is all really happening. This all has real consequences. So when people tell you, well, they couldn't really, add on teachers and stuff with the ESSER 1 and 2 funds, that was completely illegal, and it's expanded upon in the ARPA funding. They can hire school counselors. They can hire school nurses. School nurses blew up, and I mean blew up in terms of how many positions exist now. When all of this ends, that is going to collapse. That part of that economy, with all the school nurses and all that stuff, is going to completely collapse on itself. It's already collapsing in on itself, but it's because of the issue of burnout, because they're doing all of this testing, stuff that they aren't really supposed to be doing on the day-to-day, 24 hours a day when they're at school as the school nurses. They're supposed to be doing other activities. But they've expanded to becoming basically testers all day, every day for COVID. School psychologists, schools that never had a psychologist before now have a psychologist, and psychologists, we're talking upwards of $60,000 and $70,000 a year salaries that they have to try and maintain on budgets that don't increase a lot. And you have school social workers, which are also not cheap when you get them en masse. So this is really important to sort of recognize. There's other things, the McKinney-Vento funds. I don't want to get into that. There's a lot to this, and it's not. I'm just trying to highlight the parts that you all need to understand. In addition to the student performance outcomes, the Office of Learning Recovery will also identify best practices and programs. Basically, it's just a feedback loop of social emotional garbage. This is the line that I think this is sort of how they kind of slip in that they're going to work with people like Panorama, but they don't say it outright, unlike in Arizona and the other states. They say at this time, the North Carolina Department of Instruction has not determined that it will directly fund community agencies and other third-party providers. Panorama would count as a third-party provider, by the way, which explains why we aren't hearing about this until now, because they would have been engaging in not outside contracts, but contracts that would have needed to be negotiated at this time. But rather will fund partnerships between these entities and the PSU. So basically, they're saying we are not going to do and the North Carolina DPI sort of backs away from this later on, but they're like, we're not going to partner with third parties to provide SEL stuff directly, but we're kind of going to, and we're going to kind of facilitate those partnerships between the public schools and the entities themselves. So just be aware of that. They admit that in this. Blah, blah, blah. Requirement of feedback. They literally use the word feedback loop, and this is why I've been using this all along. With the requirement of a feedback loop of stakeholders will be assessed. And this is for compliance. It's completely ridiculous. Stakeholder groups, bad. Stakeholder groups are basically district yes men. All right. There's also an equity resolution that the State Board of Education passed. I'm going to have to sort of explain this to you. Let me get off of this. We're at page 39 to 47. There isn't much left that isn't really surprising, but let's kind of go and talk about whatever this is kind of looking like. So let me get off of here. Let me get out of here. Let's go back to, oops, no, we're not looking at you. We are going straight over to yep, we're back. What I was looking up about PSUs, because I didn't understand what the term was, I also found this. Public school units partner with the NCEC to assist teachers widen the support for students. This is a program that basically is exclusively being funded to provide high-quality social and emotional academic support. This is one of those I believe this is one of those third-party vendors or state agencies, state adjacent agencies or programs that exist that are being used on purpose through the Education Stabilization Fund, the ESSER funds, the GEAR funds. So this exists. I will pop that into the description. Access, I will pop this in just so that you can know what Access is. It's for English language learners. There's nothing really suspicious in here that I could find. I think it's perfectly fine. State Board. Oh, this is the bad stuff. All right, let's move it over here. The North Carolina State Board of Education, a resolution to support equity and excellence in the North Carolina public education. Whereas, I'm not going to go through all the whereases because what matters is the now therefore be it resolved. And remember, this was adopted. I will point out that this was adopted on September 3rd of 2020. Be it resolved that the State Board of Education embraces equity as a framework to promote student academic success granted in appropriate supports for academic, social, emotional learning, and well-being. And be it resolved that the State Board, its leadership members, and advisors join every educator, parent, and advocate in North Carolina with a solemn commitment to eliminate every equity barrier and opportunity gap in our great state, such that no North Carolina public school student has to overcome such inequities on his or her own. Be it resolved that the State Board will review and appropriately revise its policies through an equity lens and commit to work with the Superintendent and Department of Public Instruction to create and maintain an equity officer to ensure consistency and continuity with this essential guiding principle inside and outside the agency. And Be it resolved that the State Board, through its oversight of the Department of Public Instruction, commits to using its policy and strategy to provide equitable opportunities for every student within the North Carolina system of public education. Be it resolved that the State Board will provide resources such that students see themselves reflected in curriculum to support culturally affirming environments. So we're talking CRT here. I mean, you see in where the pinpoints are on this. Be it resolved that the State Board supports districts in changing school names that reasonably are preserved as highly offensive to a significant portion of the local community, and supports districts preserving reasonable, feasible, and strategic opportunities to desegregate, to create intergroup, to desegregate, to create intergroup contact with different racial and ethnic populations. I thought schools were desegregated after Brown versus Board of Education. So this is like, we're not back to Brown v. Board. I don't know how we got to that, but we're talking about a lot about this in Massachusetts because of the names on schools that are that are named after local Native American tribes. But this is a lot more wide sweeping, and this is also why there's other issues going. Like, there was a bill introduced in Massachusetts about this that was just about Native American names, and it had a pretty decent chance of just passing through. And then the people who co-sponsored it and the committee that was reviewing it got ambitious and put it for almost everything. And then it stopped. I think that I don't need to explain how something that is, over the top and over regulatory just stops so quickly. When a lot of people can't, it's one thing. It is potentially, you can probably get, based on the climate that we exist in, to get a lot of people to agree that naming schools after Native American tribes shouldn't be the case anymore. But when you expand that to everything, this is when things stops. However, North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, their State Board of Education, basically said, we're going to do it. So they made a resolution that that's exactly what they're going to do. Be it resolved that the State Board expects public school units to align their strategic goals to the broad goals of the State Board established for North Carolina, guided by equity, and to create collaborative school-community relationships to improve student learning, offering equitable, blah, 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 blah. Providing equal opportunities for all students. They say providing equal opportunities for all students, and then they talk about using an equity lens, and being resolved that they direct the Secretary of the State Board. The Secretary of the State Board is, by the way, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, aka Catherine Truitt, who sits in the seat right now, to enter a signed copy of this resolution into the official minutes of the North Carolina State Board of Education, and she did, in fact, sign it. It's not on this copy, but I'm sure you can find it on their website. And if you had any doubts in your mind, and we're going to zoom in a little bit here, that the State Board was woke, or that they adopted woke things, this is the State Board of Education's Strategic Plan Action Framework, and these are their guiding principles. The whole child, every student enters school, healthy lifestyle, active learners, personalized learning, challenge for future employment. And then there's equity. This is their definition of equity. The State Board is committed to delivering equitable opportunity to every student in North Carolina, bearing in mind that fair is not always equal, and equal is not always equitable. Therefore, educational equity is the belief and practice of ensuring that every student is treated in a fair and just manner, providing the necessary allocation of resources for the success of every student, and eliminating discriminatory barriers to full participation and opportunities to every student. So if you have any doubt, this is in the State Board's own words that they have adopted their guiding principles. And there's more to this, which I'm not going to go over because, quite frankly, this is too much for me right now. So let's kind of just take a minute to walk through all of this. If you managed to get to this point and didn't think I muted myself for the whole video. The State Board is woke in North Carolina. We knew this. The reason we learned knew this. Sloan knows this. All the people over at, I can't remember what that action committee is, but they know it. Chris Rufo has pointed this out. There's a lot of people that have pointed this out. But I don't think people understand just how bad this is. It's state funded through ARPA. It's state funded through ESSER 2. It is state funded through ESSER 1. This has been going on since last year when the first aid package got passed. It's all there in black and white for you to watch. If you want to, go back and watch some of the stuff that I'm talking about. And I know this is a lot to get through. And I know that the presentation may be difficult in some ways. But what I'm trying to do in these videos is to show you where to look, how to look, what my thought process is, and try and kind of guide you through how you should start to look and click on things to try and assemble the pieces of the story together. Because just because your state is woke and you're like, oh my God, they're just starting to do this, it didn't start overnight. It started a while back, and it probably started before all this ESSER stuff. It probably started way before that, but we'd have to really dig into the details on this. For our purposes, if we know that it started right at the start of the pandemic with the CARES Act funding, I think that's back a ways enough to understand, when we're back ways enough to move forward on this, to move forward and understand where we've gone and to know where we're going on this. But when we're talking about, it almost doesn't matter if we go back 20 years and know that how bad this is. It almost doesn't matter. What matters is the past few years that will instruct us how to move forward on this. It's important to know where we've come from on this particular topic, but for the average person that is struggling, and I mean truly, truly struggling to get through this and to not feel like they're spinning themselves into a frenzy, I think we really, really, we got to just start off with, beginning of pandemic is a good place to look at when all these resolutions got put into place, when all this stuff really got brought up into the light, and to just sort of go forward from there. Because it's been 2 whole years. That's a long time. And I think that's a lot for people to process. So that's sort of why when it comes to this stuff, I'm only going so far back, because it's not worth going much further because it's so bad. But with that is the video. I really appreciate if you guys got through this, and if you figured out, I realized that I messed up a couple minutes in and I knew that I was muted. So exciting. Especially on this particular stream. You know what? It happens. Stuff happens when you try and do lives. It's never going to be perfect. I'm just not even I'm going to accept my fate on that one. I think I can edit this so that part can get cut out, because I'd like it to go straight to the video as a good example of what's going on. But without further ado, thank you for listening to this video. Like, share, and subscribe if you like this content. You can follow me on Twitter at JusticeJHG. That is at JusticeJHG. You can also find me on Locals. You can be a supporter, or you can just be a free member. Locals is free to join. And I post a lot of content on there that you can see for free. But if you want to comment and if you want to engage a little bit more in the community, you got to be a subscriber. That's justicegraves.locals.com is my Locals community. That is justicegraves.locals.com. And I've been more active on there. I've been trying to do weekly streams on there, just trying to get into the flow. There's a lot of new and exciting things happening, working with some creators to do some cross stuff that I think will be really interesting moving forward. But that is all I'm going to tell you. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great rest. I'm not going to say have a great rest of your, well, I hope you have a great rest of your day, because this stuff certainly makes you want to have a cold shower. Not really a cold shower to wake up, that you really went through all of this, and then a hot shower to sort of rinse it all off, because it is absolutely disgusting what's going on lately. And that's all I have for you. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate your support. And I'm going to awkwardly stare off into the distance as I go and try and end this broadcast. Thank you.